Hello and welcome to this week's topic, which is managing international and development projects. What we're going to be looking at this week is how we manage projects in an international context, but we're particularly going to concern ourselves with development projects. That is the transfer of knowledge and projects and project management from perhaps more developed countries of the world into developing countries, because this is really where many issues lie. The reading for this week, we have a number of chapters in the Kirster textbook, International Project Management, as core reading for you to do. I've also identified two other general articles, the Solisather et al. Article, Strategic and Cultural Misalignment, Knowledge Sharing Barriers in Project Networks, is useful if you're interested in this topic, and also Organizational Cultural Intelligence by Yitman from 2013. That's also helpful, and it looks at it from within the context of the construction industry. But there are two particular articles which I think will be very well worth reading. As you'll see, they're highlighted with an asterisk. These papers form the basis of the tutorial that's normally run in this week. So there's the ICA article from 2012. That's about project management for development in Africa. And that paper is interesting because it looks at why projects are failing and what can be done about it. And then the second paper is the Relimila and Purushottam article, Project Management Trilogy, Challenges in Africa. And that looks also at many of the issues looking at managing projects and development projects within Africa. We'll be returning to those at the end of today's lecture because there's a number of questions that I would like you to address from those articles. Now, of course, there's many different types of international projects. We can think about commercial projects, that's within companies, within multinational corporations, or even small businesses establishing and expanding overseas, but also between firms. So within the supply networks, there might be joint projects, joint venture activities between different companies. But we also have what we might call international development projects. So these tend to be transformative projects, projects that really make a difference and help to develop the economy or install infrastructural projects in a town, in a village, or within a particular country. These often address a specific problem or issue. Now, quite often you get a series of projects, so these are often called a program that's intended to address a series of issues and problems such as water provision, health problems, and so on. Now, these often involve governments, non-governmental organisations, NGOs, and charities as well. And clearly some negative press has been in the media recently regarding charities such as Oxfam, where some issues have arisen, ethical issues have arisen in their project work overseas. But nonetheless, looking beyond that, we need to be looking at all the good work that's done and development work that's done by these charities and NGOs. And the third category of international projects I want to identify is what we might call global or regional projects. These tend to have generic applicability and outcomes. So it might be we have projects addressing pollution and environmental issues such as emissions, also application of common standards, for example, for health and safety and so on. Okay, so there's a broad range. We're not just going to restrict ourselves to looking at commercial projects, but we'll be looking at government-based regional projects and also looking at development projects as well. Now, clearly, there's a whole set of factors that influence international projects. And if we look through these, there's clearly economic factors that influence the projects. Do we have the money for the projects? where is the funding coming from, and so on. We have legal and political issues. Some parts of the world are very difficult to work in, either because of the rule of law or the non-rule of law and differences in legal systems, and also political problems also can get in the way at government level or local politics, in fact. Security issues can be a big concern. There's some parts of the world that are very dangerous to work in. Some of the parts of the world that really need these development projects, if we look at Yemen, for example, at the moment, are clearly some of the most difficult places in the world to work. Infrastructural issues as well. We can't just assume that the transport and communication systems in different parts of the world are going to work efficiently and effectively as they would do with a project just within our own nation. There's all sorts of cultural issues, of course. Many of you will have done the comparative business cultures module with me and will identify that actually trying to work on international projects is not just a matter of working with local culture, but also you've got people on the project team from different backgrounds. So multicultural teamwork is often or is always a feature of these international projects. And then finally, we have issues to do with geography. Some of the big infrastructural projects are very demanding. The geography might well be against us. The terrain, the weather conditions and so on might set up natural constraints in terms of what we're able to do. Okay, now that categorization is from Larson and Gray, one of the main textbooks that's used in project management. So clearly you can read about it more if you dig a bit deeper into the Larson and Gray textbook. But it's just a general background as to some of the often constraining factors in terms of managing international projects. Now, if we look particularly at cross-cultural considerations, this is what we need to be thinking about in international project management, because projects stand or fall by good teamwork and people working together, and also with providers and users, or if you like, beneficiaries from the projects being able to work together. Now, definition of culture is it's a system of shared norms, beliefs, values and customs that bind people together. But to what extent, the key question in project management is to what extent should a project manager or should you as an individual adjust to local norms and customs? So when you're doing your work, should you go completely native in the place where you're working? Should you adjust completely? Or should you actually try and impose your own ways of working and your own culture to some extent? And this is obviously a very key concern. Now, very typically, one of the biggest blunders is to take an overly ethnocentric approach. That is, to actually stick to what you know and to adopt the same approach as you would do within your own country, within your own company setting. Because there's a tendency to believe that one's cultural values and ways of doing things are superior to all others. Now, this is particularly an issue in project management because as project managers, we believe that we see the world in a particular way. We have experience and we know how project management should be done. We insist that project management and project leadership is quite different to other forms of management. So having to make adjustments to our project management thinking is often a big conundrum. You know, to what extent should we adapt, or to what extent should we stick to the tried and trusted ways of project management? So clearly some adjustments need to be made. There can be a difficulty sometimes if you want to conduct business only on your own terms. And there's dangers of stereotyping locals, other nationals as inefficient, not knowledgeable, and so on. And clearly as well, we want to think about people within the project. We want to ensure that we build up relationships. There's always a danger of putting work ahead of trust and relationships. And clearly the project manager also needs to be culturally intelligent. So what that means is, as well as being emotionally intelligent and technically intelligent, the project manager needs to understand differences and be knowledgeable on differences in culture. So as I say, there's generally a danger that people try and impose their project management thinking. Very often the funding bodies who fund these international projects want it run in this efficient way. But there is a danger that it's seen as being imposed or not adjusting to real local needs. So it's a big issue to be thinking about. What we need to say is that we need to make some adjustments. So people have different perceptions of time and space, have different views as to punctuality, differences in terms of attitudes to ethics, different ways of managing personal and professional relationships, and different attitudes towards work and life. So we haven't got the time here to go into that in great detail. Many of you will have done the comparative business cultures module with me last semester, and therefore can bring a lot of that into play here. But certainly it is a big consideration and something that needs to be thought through, and to be honest is often ignored in many of the standard project management textbooks and methodologies. So these are some of the issues that the project manager needs to think about. This is very similar to a slide I put up on the comparative business cultures module, but we're looking particularly at the project management here. So how should the project manager plan, organize and control the project work that's done by people of different nationalities? How does the project manager adjust their approach to management, motivation, communication and leadership? And there are other factors there. Things like evaluating performance is often an issue. Some project management is very much caught up with the notion of performance management, managing for a particular outcome, a clear and particular outcome. And some cultures that can be seen as quite divisive, or runs the danger of exposing individuals, which can be a problem. And also, how do you handle things like labour relations, unionisation and the workforce, given the different traditions that we might face? Now, clearly with many international projects and many projects otherwise, what we see is that we need to be thinking a lot about technology transfer, because very often a project is something that's new, something that hasn't been done before, and we need to be thinking about how we transfer that knowledge. Often it's called technology transfer, often it's known as knowledge transfer as well. So what we're going to be looking at here is what is technology transfer, what the main components are. I'm going to introduce a model for technology transfer for you, which is very helpful for a project manager who's involved in these development projects. And we're also going to consider about how we might want to manage the change process. Now, the first thing is to say that technology transfer as a topic hasn't been widely written about or published. That might intrigue some of you, because it seems to be such a core issue as we move forward in the knowledge society. But in fact, it's a very under-researched and misunderstood subject. The first thing we have to do is to recognise that actually technology and knowledge transfer covers a very large sphere, but we can in fact identify two types of transfer. The first type is what's known as vertical transfer, which is very typical of what's done in-house or of domestic projects at a particular national setting. Now, vertical transfer looks like this, and often involves research and then development and then transfer into production operation. So this tends to be very much in the realms of new technology, innovation, R&D activities, R&D projects, inventions, taking things from research through the lab into production and into operation. Okay, so very often when we think about designing new products, for example, we might think about a vertical transfer in this way. It's where the transfer item is actually changed and where we've got a new innovation involved. So what you find for international projects, it's more likely to occur between countries at the same level of development. So, for example, large multinational corporations working on global products or services will often work, people in different countries will work on the project and will be working in those activities. We might look at national space agencies who might combine and work together on putting satellites up into the sky and so on. And what you'll tend to find is that that is an example of vertical transfer. The other type of transfer is the horizontal transfer. And essentially, this is where you're transferring an existing technology. You're not making too many modifications to it, but you're transferring an existing technology, existing product, service, or way of doing things from one context, for example, from one country to another. So this is where you're simply transferring existing or known knowledge from one place into another situation. So a good example of a horizontal transfer company would be McDonald's. McDonald's open up their restaurants in different parts of the world, and in fact what they're doing is replicating existing models, existing knowledge, existing technology from one place to another, but they are transferring that technology. Other examples might be setting up power plants, using World Bank development aid money, for example, or it could be a company that's offshoring, moving its production from and lifting up its factory from a home location to actually place it overseas for overseas production. So in international projects, it's a common means of transferring technology from industrialized to developing countries. Of course, in reality, most transfers are hybrids between the two. In any new product or new service development, we might see it as vertical transfer, but there would still be some existing technology and adaptation taking place. And likewise with horizontal transfer, it's very unusual for us to just transfer exactly the same knowledge and technology from one location to another. Very often technologies need to be adapted or refined to suit the new context. And so there is clearly a linkage between the two. But as I say, we can think about technology or knowledge transfer as being transfer from one place to another. So what is technology transfer? A good definition is that it's the transfer of knowledge relating to the design of a product, its manufacture, the provision of a service, all the expertise of the support services pertaining to the product or service. So it can be technology transfer of a product, or it can be transfer of the process, or it can be transfer of services, or any associated expertise to provide that product or service. So what I want to get over is that it's not just the introduction of new hardware, but also the techniques and skills to operate it, and hopefully the potential to instill and sustain the new technology. And sustainability is a very key aspect in international project work. It's no good transferring knowledge and a technology if that is then just not operationalized and is not sustained going forward into the future. Now, if you haven't instilled the skills and the competencies to continue operating that new technology, then the project will be a failure. Okay, so the components include the hardware. So this is what most people think about or conceive when thinking about technology. So the buildings, assembly lines, equipment, tools, etc. But also we have the people and knowledge. Sometimes people use this rather horrendous term, humanware. Successful technology transfer is actually very much a human process. It's the transfer between people of knowledge, interchanging ideas and learning from this. So what do we mean by knowledge? Well, it could be product knowledge, it could be operations and process knowledge of how to produce the product or service, or it could be technical knowledge about the equipment. So very often it's just know-how about how to use the technology. And we can also add on to their training as well, because clearly we need to transfer technologies, we need to transfer knowledge and know-how through training, and so expertise in that training process is important. Finally, we have software. Now, when most people think of software, they just think of computer software, but we can broaden out what we mean by software. It can include the manuals, the procedures, documentation information, all the software, all the procedural material and process material required to actually manage and combine the hardware with the people side and the know-how of how to operate that technology. Okay, so those are some of the components. Now let's have a look at some of the elements in technology transfer. Clearly, in any technology transfer, you have the transfer item, and we have to be absolutely clear that we have defined what it is that's being transferred. You know, is it a particular product? Is it a process? And so on. There's always a danger here, again, of project creep, that we enter into a project to transfer something, and then people start adding things on or expect it to be more than what we expect. So it might seem fairly obvious, but we do need to clearly define what it is that's being transferred, what knowledge and know-how technology is in the project, and what's actually outside of it, so that people are very clear on what needs to be transferred. We also need to identify who's sending the technology, so who has the knowledge at the moment and is sending it, and who are the recipients, who is actually receiving the technology. Now again, this might seem obvious, but often we don't always target exactly who the beneficiaries are for any technology transfer, an international development project. In that situation, the right people aren't trained, and it doesn't become sustainable. In fact, sometimes it doesn't even penetrate down to the people in need. Likewise, there can sometimes be an oversight as to who has the knowledge to transfer. So who is actually donating or sending or being paid, and who has the knowledge that needs to be transferred. Clearly, these have to be very closely defined in any transfer project, and any international development project. You would need to know and define and agree with everybody exactly what items being transferred, who's sending it, and who's the targeted recipient of that technology and knowledge. There are other factors as well. The fourth element would be the transfer mechanism. How exactly are we going to transfer it? So, you know, are we going to use, for example, a build, operate, transfer model? This involves large infrastructural projects, such as, for example, power generation plants, where people might see the need to establish a new power generation plant in a developing country of the world. But we need to think about how we're going to transfer that. And one way that's often used is to say that the sender, the people who are knowledgeable, the people with the technology, will build it, will operate it and get it up and running, and then we'll transfer it to local operation at a local date, what's known as a build, operate, transfer. Sometimes this is also seen as a turnkey project, i.e. that the user at the other end, it's all set up, it's made operational, and then simply they need to turn the key for it all to operate. There are other issues about how you transfer the process as well. How are we going to interact? What communication channels need to be opened up, and so on. And there are two other factors that we need to think about. The first one is the rate of diffusion of the technology. At what rate do we send the knowledge and do we transfer the technology? If we do it too quickly, the recipients can't grasp it. It's a little bit like a lecture, isn't it? If the lecturer rattles through it too quickly, then people can't keep up. Whereas if you send it too slowly, clearly people get a little bit frustrated. So at what rate should we be diffusing the technology? At what rate should we do it so that it's done optimally and at a rate that people can grasp? And that links on the other side, on the recipient side. What's the absorptive capacity of the recipient? In other words, are they able to understand the knowledge, the know-how and the technology? Or are we starting at a very low level where they're going to struggle to actually understand? We're going to have to spend more time and thinking about the rate of diffusion. So, for example, in doing a lecture again, a lecture is a technology transfer process, but the lecturer has to decide not just the rate of diffusion from their own point of view, what their capacity is to present the material and to transfer the knowledge and know-how from the lecture, but also you have to take account of the ability of the students, the other side, to understand some of this knowledge. So when I teach, for example, to practicing project managers, I can assume that they've been involved with projects and will grasp this subject fairly quickly because they will have seen some of the issues and the problems. However, if I'm doing this class to some first year undergraduate students, then clearly their level is different and they're going to have great difficulty absorbing the knowledge and the know-how from this lecture, for example, because they haven't got the knowledge and they haven't sort of worked up the levels of education to get to the point to understand it. This is clearly why this subject, for example, is a final year module, because it's assuming that you have got a background in your studies already. You've probably developed a little bit of knowledge through cases and even working, and you're able to grasp some of the issues. Okay, so when we look at this, all of these influence and determine the technology transfer process. And if you get one of these right, if one of these is ill-defined or not well designed or thought through, the whole project can fail. So it's, if you like, it's a checklist for you to look at when you're involved in international project work. Have we clearly identified and defined these and adjusted the project accordingly to succeed? This is the technology transfer process with those elements shown diagrammatically. We have the sender, sometimes people call it the donor, because sometimes the technology is sent in a charitable way, and we have the recipient at the other side. The item is being transferred between, so clearly identified. The transfer mechanism is the way in which we send the knowledge or know-how, the transfer item, from the sender to the recipient. But then we've got a little bit of filtering, the sender has the knowledge, but at what rate are they able to send it, and should they send that? And then on the other end, another filter is how well can the recipient absorb that? Are we able to send it and transfer it quickly, or do we need to do a lot more preparation, training, and sort of slow the rate of diffusion of the technology? Okay, so what makes a successful development project? How should any project success be judged? So in international projects, we can look at it in different ways. Sometimes projects are judged very much from the donor perspective. Has it been successful? We hear this a lot from charities about how effective and efficient they are in the use of their resources, in the use of donated money, in actually providing aid, assistance, development work, and so on. So we can judge it from the donor perspective. We can also look at it in terms of how well the project was managed. So from the project manager's perspective, that's also one way in which we can actually judge success. It may be seen successful from a donor perspective, but the project manager who's seeking to manage the project as efficiently and effectively as possible might well see that there were some shortcomings. Really importantly, of course, is from the recipients or the locals' perspective. There's sometimes some criticisms in development projects that everybody achieves and complies with their performance objectives, but actually the recipients don't really view it as a success or don't feel that they've got that benefit from it. So it also has to be looked at from the locals or the recipient's perspective. Then also really importantly, particularly for development projects, is how do we view it from a sustainability perspective? You know, if we're too quick to judge a project and its performance, it might well be that we see it as a success, but actually 2, 3, 4 years down the line, the technology and the know-how hasn't really embedded itself and isn't really being sustained moving forward. There's histories of, for example, wells being sunk in villages where it was provided, everybody thought it was successful, the aid agency left, only to find later on that the well wasn't being used because it wasn't being maintained, because nobody was there to actually manage and sustain that well. So we need to be thinking about that as well. Now there's a nice video for you to watch. There's a clickable link there, or it is on the KLE module page, which is all about performance measures for development projects. And there's an aid worker talking there who's worked on numerous projects, and he's going to talk particularly about his work in Togo in Africa. So that's well worth looking at in terms of judging success and from which perspective we should be looking at the success of international projects. Now, another important point, just part of that really, but all part of the project management process in international development work, is that there are obviously now many channels for communication in international project management. Some of you who do the comparative business cultures module, where you worked virtually with a group in Germany with the German students, will be aware that actually clarifying the channel for communication is really important. Now, do we do everything face to face? Do people have to travel? Or can we use telephone? Is email okay? Or can we use audio or video conference? You know, it could be a group, or it could be just individuals from desks using things like Skype. Or should we be using things like shared databases and folders and so on, you know, using Dropbox or Google Drive and so on to share resources and knowledge? Now, clearly this is a really important area, and in today's high technology world, you have to be aware of not just the best channel to use, but how to do this really efficiently and effectively. Some projects, of course, are managed entirely and most partially using virtual team working. People are multiply located around the world. People might be in a home base and the sender's home base for the technology, whereas other people are out in the field. You've got the recipients as well out in the field, and clearly that in today's world that calls for particular skills that are demanded there. You need to have really good skills in time management to plan meetings. Any of you who move into this new know that it's a real area of confusion. Although it might seem obvious, you do need to really be clear on what channel you're using, what channels are being adopted, and also precisely when, including time differences, when the meetings are taking place in and meetings or other activities that you're involved with. Okay, so what I would say these days is that that's very clearly an important area, and also be careful not to assume that in the field or locally, particularly in developing countries, that they have access to high-speed internet linkages or even basic telecommunications such as telephones and so on. So you have to give that some thought. Okay then, so what we've done, this is the summary slide for this week's lecture. We've looked at different types of international projects, not just commercial projects, but also development projects of other types. We've looked at some of the factors affecting international projects, specifically 6 areas of factors in the earlier slide, but also towards the end I've also looked at issues to do with communication and culture and technology transfer. I've introduced to you this basic model of technology transfer, or if you like, knowledge transfer. And finally, we've just given a little bit of thought to managing international projects and the use and the appropriate use of communication technologies. Now, the tutorial for this week, what I want you to do, what I want you to work on, is to select either the Ruel Mila article or the ICA article. So read one or the other, because both of those papers are focused on projects in Africa, and they're quite enlightening papers. What I want you to do is to identify 3 or 4 main reasons for project failure in Africa that are provided within those papers. So those papers will talk about some of the problems, the issues, and so on. So I want you to identify 3 or 4 main reasons for project failure in Africa. And then, having looked at those reasons for failure, try and identify some solutions to the problems, preferably as identified in the paper, but you will also be able to introduce your own ideas as well. Now, in the tutorials, if they do take place, what we'll do is review both papers, where our focus will be on development projects, and I'll ask for individuals or groups of you just to identify some of the project failure reasons and some of the solutions to the problems, with a view to how to better manage development projects in Africa. That's the end of the lecture for this week. I hope that this recording is useful for you, and I hope that you're able to sort of get some benefits as we've moved away now from tools and techniques of basic project management. We're looking at some of the issues relating to managing projects across boundaries and from developed to developing countries and so on. And this has been the main focus of today's lecture. Okay, thank you very much. Goodbye.